Unbiased News is a myth. Ground News is a news comparison platform that empowers you to see how the political biases of different sources are influencing the news you read. Download the Ground News app for free at davidpakman.com/ground. Joe Biden promised to deliver 100 million vaccine doses into the arms of Americans in 100 days. And we are, I am thrilled to say, on track to dramatically surpass that. And at the same time, we are seeing coronavirus cases continue to decline very quickly, faster than many people expected. So let's run through the numbers. Then I have other COVID updates. We did this each of the last few weeks. I didn't think that many people would actually like this. But it turns out a lot of people aren't following the day-to-day of what's going on with the virus, understandably. And a ton of people wrote in saying, actually, the summaries are useful in terms of where we are. So let's jump right in with one disclaimer. I'm going to give a lot of optimistic news in this segment. It should not be used to encourage us to stop being careful. The optimistic news should tell us, let's keep being careful, not go crazy. And if we do that, then there is hopefully a light at the end of the tunnel. And yes, I will address the variants, of course. All right, so let's start with cases. Coronavirus cases on average peaked on January 11th at about 255,000 cases per day, an insane number. The good news is that since that peak, cases have declined a whopping 64%, where we are now averaging 92,000 cases per day. Now, this is all perspective. At one point a year ago, when Dr. Fauci said, not a year ago, 8 months ago, 7 months ago, when Dr. Fauci said, if we aren't careful, we could get up to 100,000 cases per day in the fall. And a whole bunch of people said that's impossible. And of course, Dr. Fauci was right. We weren't careful. And we actually got not to 100,000 cases a day, not to 200,000 cases a day. We actually had 300,000 cases a day. We had 300,000 cases on one day in the fall. We are now back down to 92,000 cases per day. But what matters is the rate of decline, down 64% in just 35 days. You love to see it. Let's keep it going. Now, in the meantime, deaths, which lag cases by 3 to 4 weeks, are finally starting to come down, peaking at an average of about 3,500 deaths a day in the United States, more, 20% more than a 9/11 a day, now down 25% to a daily average of about 2,600 deaths per day. Still an unconscionable, horrifying number. But we are seeing the improvement, and the improvement in deaths should track the decline in cases as well, with about a 3 to 4 week lag. Now, to vaccination. Joe Biden promised 1 million doses a day. The U.S. is now exceeding that by a full 2/3, with 1 2/3 million vaccine doses per day going into people's arms, with again new record days this weekend, 2.2 million doses administered on Saturday, 2.2 million doses administered on Sunday. These are fantastic numbers, but they are not enough, because at the current rates, we wouldn't hit 50% immunity until June 28th. We wouldn't reach 70% immunity, a key number, until September 5th. So as I've said before, I didn't come up with this. Medical experts did. The ideal would be to get to 3.5 million doses per day. That would dramatically accelerate our progress. It's not impossible that we would get there with a third vaccine and hopefully with a fourth vaccine. Now, let's talk about vaccines and variants. Once again, we continue to learn more and more about this. We have 2 vaccines currently in use in the United States, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. These are both 2-dose vaccines. With Moderna, you have 28 days between doses. With Pfizer, you have 21 days between doses. Okay, we are close to approval for a third vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That is a 1-dose vaccine that will dramatically simplify logistics and could get us to 2.53 million vaccines a day regularly. Fourth vaccine has the possibility of getting us to 3.5 million vaccines a day. Meanwhile, what we know about the effectiveness of these vaccines is stunning. It's not a miracle, it's science, so I don't want to use the word miracle, but the numbers appear almost miraculous. Israel has done an incredible job with vaccination. They're already vaccinating younger people. And the deal they made with Pfizer is that they will open up their data so Pfizer can get more information about how the vaccine works in reality. One study of the vaccinated Israeli population found that in the real world, the vaccine has 94% efficacy at preventing symptomatic disease and a 92% drop in severe disease. Listen to these numbers. A study of 525,000 vaccinated Israelis found only 500 of them got the virus. That's 0.1%. 525,000 people, 500 get the virus with the vaccine. And that was including some of them got it between doses. They weren't yet at full immunity. Of the 500 people that got the virus, 4 of the 500 had what you would call a serious case. 4. And none of them died. These are incredible, incredible numbers. The vaccine appears to be as good in real life as it was in the phase 3 trials. Now, it's not all great news. We are in a fight against these variants that are spreading. The good news in that fight is that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines appear really effective against the UK variant and the Brazilian variant, and they appear less but still quite effective against the South Africa variant. It's just a matter of speed. The faster we vaccinate, the more we prevent mutation, the more we prevent the spread of the variants, which are slightly stronger against the vaccine. If you imagine the variants in a fight against the vaccines, and the more we can control this. So if we can keep this going, we are going to have a very different situation statistically in the United States by April 1st, and again, a different situation by May 1st. If we can get beyond 1 2/3 million vaccines a day, if we can get to 2.5 steady or 3, we are looking at moving up the date at which 70% of the country will be vaccinated from early September into August, possibly even into July, or according to some models, even late June, if we can really quickly ramp up vaccination. So let's keep tracking numbers. The milestone I'm next looking for is when we get under 50,000 cases per day. That might only be weeks away. If we can keep going, it could be longer. We will soon see. And fortunately, vaccine hesitancy, I won't dive into that a lot now because we did that last week. Vaccine hesitancy also continues to go down. All good things. We are hoping also for approval on the vaccination of kids, 10, 12, 14 years old by early summer, optimistically. And that will also be a big factor. So a lot of good things happening. Not the time to go crazy. Not the time to go crazy. Light at the end of the tunnel. We see it. Okay, let's talk about Joe Biden on immigration. Now, Joe Biden has made it clear that the immediate next priority is COVID relief. I've already criticized and said it should have been done already. It hasn't. We're hoping that it gets done soon. Very soon thereafter, immigration is going to be high on Joe Biden's list. Now, much of what Joe Biden wants to do on immigration cannot be done by executive order. One bit of good news is that Joe Biden has canceled the national emergency order that Donald Trump was using to try to get money for his border wall. Joe Biden sent a letter to Congress late last week saying that no further tax dollars will be spent on the wall. Now, you might be wondering, but there was no wall. Trump promised a wall across the entire border. It never happened. What are we talking about here? That is true. But remember that Donald Trump declared a state of emergency over the southern border in 2019. That allowed him to use some military funding for construction of the wall. Now, the disastrous news is that Trump did manage to spend $25 billion on the project. The unfortunate, it's sort of like a Pyrrhic victory that Donald Trump had because he was able to obtain money for the wall, but they were really able to do mostly some replacement of existing border wall areas with a new type of wall and expand it slightly. So as far as a campaign promise, Trump failed on having a wall across the entire border. That was his promise. He made it very, very clearly and said that was a first-term accomplishment that he would have. Didn't happen. On the other hand, it's good news in the sense that not much of it took place, and Joe Biden is able to shut down this emergency declaration of emergency and to stop pulling any more money from the military for the wall. This is the continued use of executive orders by Joe Biden to undo many of the disasters that Donald Trump did. Of course, much like debt and deficit, executive orders have become a political football. If your guy or gal is in power and using executive orders, then you say these executive orders are required and necessary to undo the damage of the previous president. If your guy or gal is not in the Oval Office, then you call executive orders, at least if you're a Republican, a sort of authoritarian, tyrannical circumvention of the normal legislative process. That's the way it's been for a while. It's pretty similar to the debt and deficit, but it is a good thing that Joe Biden has been doing this, particularly when the Republican Party is more obstructionist, arguably, than it has ever been. The exact numbers are that 80 miles of new barriers were built during the Trump administration where there were none, and otherwise there were just replacements of existing parts of border wall or border fencing. So I think this is an important time to just remind you that we know a lot about what circumstances call for a wall and what circumstances do not. One of the really interesting things is that even without the wall, remember, Trump only added 80 miles. Without a wall across the entire border, as promised by Trump, Trump regularly claimed border crossings are lower than ever. So that's proof that if you believe that, that's proof that it is not a wall that reduces border crossings. And of course, we've long studied the reasons why it is absurd to spend these ungodly amounts of money on a wall. We know that, and we've seen examples of being able to scale the wall with about $100 in parts from any hardware store, Home Depot, Lowe's, that type of place. It is easily defeated. Number two, you have a significant portion of people who are in the United States illegally who have overstayed visas or came for tourism and never left. And they are mostly flying in, not crossing the physical border at the U.S.-Mexico border. And then lastly, if you want to think about the best ROI, the best return on investment for dealing with the issue of undocumented immigration, we really should be approaching this from why are people wanting to come to the United States to begin with? Understanding the economic conditions in the source countries, not just Mexico, but further south as well, and working with those countries. And if we are supposed to be sort of agnostic to how the money is spent, as long as it effectively deals with the undocumented immigration problem, then you would think that the right would be open to the ideas of economists and others who have said, well, let's, instead of building a wall that can be defeated and won't actually address a lot of the people that fly in and overstay visas or just never leave when they come for vacation, let's actually spend money by improving economic circumstances in some of these source countries. Now, the problem is we know that for them, a big aspect of this is not just doing what's most effective. It's doing what feels right based on their framework of morality, as they would call it, or maybe as we would describe it. And to them, it would seem wrong in some way to give money to improve a country when people are coming here illegally. It just doesn't feel right to the ideology that many of these right wingers are committed to. But study after study, as we've outlined in our long form piece about this issue, confirms that that actually would be the most effective way to curb undocumented immigration to the United States. So the micro story, Joe Biden has cut that emergency declaration. There is not even a mechanism with which you could pull money from the military to build the wall. Next step is Biden's got to deal with DACA. And it is finally time, with Democrats controlling the White House, the House, and the Senate. If it's not going to happen now, I don't know that it will ever happen. It's finally time to really do the immigration reform we've been talking about it's been 15 years or longer at this point. Send me your thoughts. You can find me on Twitter at @DPakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The riots at the Capitol made it very clear that misinformation is one of the biggest problems that our society faces, and online filter bubbles make the problem worse, making it difficult even for intelligent news consumers to figure out what's true and what's not. One of our sponsors is Ground News, which is a platform with a really effective approach to combating this problem. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform that lets you compare how sources from across the political spectrum are covering a story. I use it myself. I love it because it lets me easily see how different news outlets are manipulating a story to fit their own narrative. And it shows you your news blind spots, stories that your side of the political spectrum may not be giving attention to. Start out 2021 with a balanced news diet. Download the Ground News app for free by going to davidpakman.com/ground. The link is right underneath this video.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show as a show depends on people who like what we are doing enough to grab a membership at joinpakman.com. We also do a daily bonus show, an extra show every single day just for our members. I implore you to grab a membership at joinpakman.com, and you can use the coupon code BETTER21 if you would like to save some money off of the cost of a membership. We have a very interesting new poll out of Quinnipiac University about whether Republicans want Donald Trump to remain involved in American politics and in Republican Party politics for the foreseeable future. And the answer is yes, they do. Yes, they do. 3/4 of Republicans want Donald Trump to continue playing a prominent role in the Republican Party. The poll showed 89% of Republicans opposed the conviction of Donald Trump in his second Senate impeachment trial. 87% of Republicans say Trump should be allowed to hold public office in the future. 89% of Republicans believe Trump was not responsible for inciting the violence that led to the January 6th riots. And among all Americans polled, 55% opposed Trump returning to public office. So this is a very important number, because we talked last week or the week before about 64% of Republicans saying if Trump left the party and started his own party, we would follow him. Nearly 2/3 of the Republican Party has such soft support for the party, or has simply accepted Donald Trump as the sort of Lord and Savior deity head of the party at this point, that they would follow him out of it. That's not so good for the Republican Party as an institution, but it's certainly good if you're Donald Trump and you want to control the Republican Party or American politics going forward. Now we learn that although there are some Republicans who would not leave the Republican Party to follow Trump, many of them do want Trump to continue involved in American politics. Now, one important caveat is that we know from our conversation with David Shore a few weeks ago that Republicans who answer the phone and talk to pollsters are not necessarily representative of all Republicans. And David Shore believes that some of the more Trumpian QAnon conspiracy types may be refusing to participate in polls. Of course, pollsters try to and believe they have ways of accounting and adjusting for that. But David Shore was skeptical that they really are great at it. So that's something to understand. But assuming these numbers are roughly accurate, this is really bad for Republicans as a party. They lost the presidential election by almost 8 million people. And at this point in time, most of them want Trump to stay involved, and 2/3 are even willing to leave the party. I don't know how the math works out for them. And what I mean by that is if you lose a national election by 8 million, in great part because of the guy who's at the head of the party, Donald Trump, failing on coronavirus, turning off so many traditional Republicans. You lose by 8 million, and then you want that guy to stay involved. And if he leaves the party, you'll leave with him. Those are not numbers that bode well for the Republican Party in national elections. Now, at the local level, it's a very different situation. You can still, the Trumpian factor in extremely red areas that would never consider voting for example, a Democratic senator. It may in practice not have that big of an impact, but for as long as Donald Trump is so prominent, it looks really tough for the Republican Party to win national elections. And I'm glad to have my mind changed, but I don't see how the numbers work out. Now, as a matter of sort of following the easy nature by which so many Republican voters were bamboozled by Donald Trump, they fell for the populist sounding rhetoric back in 2015 and 2016. We've talked about that many times. Yeah, they fell for it and then Trump didn't do it. But they still don't seem to realize that Trump has done nothing for just your average working class Republican beyond, yes, making them really afraid of others that are going to do bad things to you. China, undocumented immigrants, Democrats, communists, Marxists, anarchists, or anarchists, as Donald Trump would call them. Yeah, he stoked fears for the average working class Republican really well. He told them lies about the things he would do, said he would fix trade. He didn't do it. Said he would build a wall across the entire U.S.-Mexico border. He didn't do it. Said he would replace Obamacare with a beautiful new health care plan. Didn't do it. So fear, false promises, coalescing the most hateful elements of the Republican Party, but they still seem not to realize that he did nothing for them economically the way he claimed to do. And now, as we know, 40% of coronavirus deaths during the Trump administration were unnecessary and avoidable. So, of course, all of the numbers, wow, how does the Republican Party win national elections in these circumstances? But the other question is, millions, tens of millions still don't realize Trump didn't do any of the things he said he would do for the working class. Do they care? Do they not know? I'm not sure. I don't know the answer. But if they never wake up to it, support for Trump in the Republican Party is likely to continue. This is really funny just because of the hypocrisy in it. There's a guy who donated more than $2 million to that completely bogus True the Vote campaign to try to take the election back from Joe Biden, despite the fact that Joe Biden won. And now one of these guys wants his money back and says he's essentially been scammed. I'm talking about right-wing rich dude Fred Eshelman. Fred Eshelman was convinced after the presidential election that something wasn't right with the results. And so he decided to donate a bunch of money to True the Vote. He called the group and said, I'm in for $2 million. And over the next couple of weeks that followed, Eshelman came to regret the donation, realized that all of these conspiracy theories about rampant illegal voting deserved to be doubted. Yes, they did. And now he wants his money back. And Trump's campaign and the Republican Party in total collected more than $250 million. That's $255 million in 2 months. They said the money would go to legal challenges. They said the money would go to recounts and so on and so forth. Very little of the money did. $76 million that Trump raised for Georgia and for reversing the results of the election didn't go to that. Instead, it went to paying off Donald Trump's campaign debts. And now at least some of these individuals are saying we got scammed and we want our money back. Now, Eshelman has filed 2 lawsuits. And one in federal court has since been withdrawn. The other is still going on in Texas state court. And he is alleging they didn't spend the money on the things they were going to spend the money on. And I want the money back. And at this point, there's a couple different things that I think are relevant to talk about here. First of all, with these types of things, one should never invest more than they are willing to lose. I mean, it's not different than cryptocurrency in a sense. I've held Bitcoin for years at this point, and I consider it speculative. I consider it part of a small portion of my assets that I am putting in what I know to be risky assets. And if it ends up being worth zero, if I get nothing from it, that's sort of part of the game. Anybody who, quote, invested, and I think that that's absolutely the wrong term, who invested money in this True the Vote campaign, you should have gone in knowing this may go to nothing. I am not going in assuming or expecting that there are going to be tangible results here. Clearly, Fred Eshelman didn't do that because he was bamboozled by the conspiracy theory. So he was played by Trump, and many of these people were played by Trump. Now, in terms of whether they deserve to get their money back, if you actually believed that this was anything short of a grift, then you clearly were not paying attention. And I do believe that some people like Fred Eshelman may not necessarily have thought that it was a scam, but they certainly might have felt that I'm a rich dude. If I throw enough money at a problem, something good is going to happen, because that's how a lot of these rich people operate in the United States. It's just a matter of throwing enough money at it and I can get whatever I want. Okay, maybe some of these claims are exaggerated, but if I give $2 million, 2.5 million people cough up $250 million. If you throw enough money at a problem, we're going to get the outcome that we want, because that's how a lot of these folks now have been conditioned. But in terms of getting the money back, a lot of these same people now alleging a scam and saying I'm filing suit and blah, 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 blah. They're the ones who say we can't have a nanny state government. We can't have a nanny state government protecting people from themselves. If people want to smoke, they should be allowed to smoke. If people want 128-ounce sodas, they should be allowed to have them, and it shouldn't be priced a different way or banned or whatever the case may be. And now they're saying something different. Shouldn't, by that very same logic, they be allowed to donate money wherever they want? And then the outcome is the outcome. Caveat emptor, buyer beware. No, now they have a different approach. And I don't know ultimately what's going to happen in court, but it is amazing that, there might be this idea that the only people Trump was able to bamboozle were lower middle class, uneducated, rural folks. No, that's very wrong. Trump also bamboozled rich, upper class folks. And we should never understate the ability of a grifter to grift lots of different people. We'll have more coverage of this on the show's Instagram page. You can find us on Instagram at David Pakman Show. We have a lot coming up today, including some really almost sad segments on Fox News last night, which we'll get to a little bit later today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The number one funding source for the David Pakman Show has been and continues to be membership. And membership is not just a feel-good thing. You get access to the world-famous bonus show every single day just for members, as well as commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show day in and day out. You can sign up for membership very, very quickly at joinpakman.com. That's joinpakman.com. If the normal prices strike you as high, by all means, use the coupon code BETTER21, all one word, all lowercase. Become a member today.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today we're going to be speaking to economist Ariel Rubinstein, professor of economics at Tel Aviv University and at New York University. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate speaking with you.
My pleasure.
So one of the two areas that are very much in right now in economics are game theory and behavioral economics. And if one reads critiques of these areas, one of the things I read frequently is that as interesting as game theory and behavioral economics are to study theoretically, that there is a limit to what these fields of study can tell us about the real world. Do you believe that this is a fair criticism?
It's a very fair criticism, and I would sign on every word that you have said. Let me first of all say, every area, probably in the sciences and also as in life, as in fashion and in other things, in politics, then we have waves. And the waves are not because somebody discovered the light or discovered the corona, cured the corona. The wave is because some sort of social pressures inside the academic world. So when I was very young, then what is called general equilibrium was dominating economics. Then actually I was a part of what is called the game theoretical revolution in economics, and that became so fashionable that actually young PhDs now almost don't know general equilibrium. And the next wave was behavioral economics, and the next wave is probably something which is very far from theoretical development. But in any case, this is first of all the fact that something is dominating a field inside economics does not mean that this is true. It is really it does mean that it's dominating. It's also it should be said that economics is probably again as any other political group is very much there is a little bit a tyranny of the governing of the dominating field. And when some field is on top, then it quite rejects the other fields. My position about economic theory in general, that it's not about truth. It's not about truth. Nothing is true. It's a little bit like literature. You know, sometimes there is one type of literature is more fashionable. Another time, another type of literature is very fashionable. My attitude in general to economic theory is that this is a bunch of stories, if you want, a bunch of fables. Now, these fables are not completely disconnected from the world. They are connected with the world, but remind you that also Disney fables are connected to the world. So it's connected to the world. It's about the world in some sense, but not in the direct way that people think or many people take it. Now, regarding continuing in this line, when we think about game theory, you know, I spent much of my life doing game theory. I don't do game theory anymore, I should say. I moved from game theory to boundary rationality, and then these days I'm doing things which are more connected to general equilibrium than to game theory. And that's not because I was disillusioned from game theory. I've never understood that game theory is some concrete lesson to or message to the world. And whenever people, and some of them are very respectable people that I admire on their academic achievements, try to claim that game theory tells something about politics, about life, about religion, or whatever, I feel very angry, I should say.
Do you think, though, that over time we will get closer to economic theory that really does tell us more, or is more highly applicable in the real world? And I guess the idea would be, we had this initial school of economics that was based on perfectly rational actors. And then over time, we learned, okay, that's not exactly the way things work. Let's introduce behavioral economics, which at least claimed to get closer to accounting for the psychology of the real world and maybe gets us a little closer. Do you think over time we will get closer and closer?
No.
You don't?
No, not in the means that, categorically, not in the means that we work on. Now, of course, it may be the case that in one point of time, in some sense, I hope that it's after I will go from this world, that the world will be so different that there will be some that we will, the way to model David or Ariel would not be in the formal way or the abstract way that we do it, but it will be, people will think about us indeed as machines, really machines, as a sort of a collection of atoms or a collection of cells that somehow interact in some way, and people will understand and decode it, and then we will stop to be David and Ariel. We will be some sort of organisms in the world, and then the world will be so much different than the world that we live in, that, you know, the question of whether economic theory will do the work or not is completely unimportant. It will be completely, I cannot imagine such a world. Now, I cannot say that it's impossible. Who I am, I'm not a scientist, I'm hardly an economist, so I am to say that that's impossible one day. But I personally, in continuing more or less developing the theories, even making them more empirically, in some sense, relevant, I don't think that we are as close, because, and again, the analogy is the analogy of literature. Do you believe that one day there will be a book that in some sense will explain the world in a perfect way, that whoever will read it will say, wow, now I understand the politics of the US, and I predict the elections in 2024? Maybe I cannot imagine something like that.
You mentioned bounded rationality, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Maybe for the people in our audience who are less familiar with some of these concepts, in general, when we talk about rationality in economics, what do we mean? And then what do you mean when we talk about more specifically bounded rationality?
Well, the way that I mean bounded rationality, I mean that in the story, namely what we call a model in our language, but I think about it just a story, there is a concrete element of the procedural aspect of decision making. That's all. When we talk about models with rationality, actually we also have a sort of a procedure, but the procedure is in some sense perfect. In some logical sense, people can do whatever calculations, they fully understand the probabilistic laws, and etc., etc. On the other hand, when people are limited, and all of us are limited, and we take it into account, or we don't take into account, I think about it more that we put it explicitly into the model, that there are some aspects of bounded rationality, then it's become a model of bounded rationality. That's all. But of course, in the interpretation of what we do, this is a big step. It's a big step because it makes some of the results, or many of the results that are common in the model when we assume full rationality, different. That's all. So
would it be fair to say that rationality as a broad concept is a more theoretical concept? Bounded rationality accounts for the real world limits of rationality?
I don't know. If you take, the example that I often give is the characters in Disney movies.
Yes.
The characters in Disney movies are usually very simple in the sense that either they are good or bad, right? It's either they're evil or tzaddik. There are two extremes. And now we can think about a world that people are either, they have some sort of a click in their minds, 0, 1, either they are good or bad. That's the end of the story. And then still there are interaction between many good and bad people in different situations. Now we can complicate it and think about the situation is more evolved and more include some sort of between being good and bad. There are many colors, and between being fully rational and being completely random, there is also a lot of varieties. And when we are interested in the way or that this procedural aspect affect the interaction between human beings, then it becomes a bounded rationality. Now, is it closer? I don't like to think about it as closer. I think that it's different. And again, closer, behind your assumption, there is this goal, which is that economic theory will predict the world, will fit the description of the world as close as possible. Personally, I must say, I've never wanted to predict anything. I don't want to predict. I want to do interesting story, to invent interesting stories, full stop. What the interesting stories will do to the world, well, there are some interesting stories that were written by people much more famous than me that really changed the world. And I don't think that the type of models that we deal with will change the world. At most, they affect the way that economists or people who are doing social sciences or think about social sciences, or a person like you, would think about the world. But this is in a very indirect way. The influence is exactly, in my opinion, almost exactly like literature. Probably the difference is that there is, I don't think that when people read a novel, they have expectations that everything will be correct, exact, describe the world, and so on. On the other hand, also the influence of course, there are some writers who were becoming prime ministers and presidents and so on. But most of the writers do not do whatever they do in a direct relation to politicians or to people who do public affairs. The difference between, in this respect, between writers and economists, that there is, I think that most of the people, including many of my friends, economists, and definitely people who think about economics and people who write in the Wall Street Journal or in the economic section in newspapers and so on, approach economists with expectations that they will tell them things which are very, very useful. Now, some people believe that economics, of course, is much more useful in the direct sense than me, and I think that the burden of proof is on them, not on me. It's not my goal. I've never given any advice to anybody, and I'm not going to give advice. It's not for money and not for fun.
That's fair. So putting aside for a moment the idea of predictive utility, can you talk maybe about some examples of situations that we can maybe better understand by understanding bounded rationality? What types of real world problems might we better understand under this umbrella?
To be honest, you ask me now a very tough question. I don't think that I can. It will be charlatanic move for me now to, in a few minutes, to say, okay, here is an example, such and such. When I was doing more game theory, and I was asked many times the same question, so probably I fell into the trap and answered this question with some examples. And when I ended the interview or whatever, then I felt, oh, come on, again, I did this mistake, and nobody understood what I meant. And look, the economic theory, in many respects, it's a study of the way that economists think, and it's very difficult, and sometimes it's very dangerous to transfer the terms directly in the public. By the way, that's the success. You mentioned the behavioral economics. The big success, the public success of behavioral economics, is because behavioral economists have a very direct communication with the public. Why they have a very direct? Because actually many of the examples and the stories that they can tell are very simple, and actually makes a lot of sense, and many of them are not very great academic achievements, but it is just common sense. And therefore, you can give a speech about behavioral economics and people will be very excited because they will feel that actually they understand the lecture, and actually they feel probably that they themselves knew some of the stuff that is told and so on.
I mean, that's an important bias maybe to understand, right? The idea that which can be more easily understood, people may be more likely to believe it is accurate, but that may not be the case.
It's not only, you see, behavioral economics, one of the big effects in the last few years is what is called, let me call it the nudge movement. The nudge movement is almost a political movement these days. It's those of the listeners that they don't know what it is. It is some very respectable economists and not only economists, lawyers and other fields believe that what is called libertarian paternalism, namely we don't want to force people to take the vaccination. Let's say that's an issue now in Israel, but we don't want to force them, and it's illegal to force them, but we can nudge them to do it, and yes. They study some ways that we will nudge them more effectively. Now, behind this, of course, there is a lot of debates in the last few years about the philosophical status of libertarian paternalism. Personally, I'm very much against this movement because of many reasons. One of them that I believe that people now it's not connected with economics. It's just my personal views. I believe in the personal responsibility to a person, and I also believe that clever people or economists or scholars who believe that they are very clever don't know what is good to other people more than the people themselves. And I feel that manipulation on people, I dismay a lot that people, even with the best intention, manipulate other people to do something. I feel that for me, it is a operation which is immoral in almost all operations.
So in a sense, Ariel,
something which is the questions about libertarian paternalism and nudge actually are things that has very little to do with academic research. These are ideas that we can discuss in a bar or in afternoon or in the evening dinner or over a table and discuss them, and probably you will have some insights as a person who is connected with human beings, not less than many of the scholars of behavioral economics. So I think that, again, it's not that behavioral economics does not have any interesting stories. It has. But the pretension of behavioral economics to be more realistic and especially the move, which is almost a political move, that you are trying to claim we know how to do something, and we actually are behind the scenes actually manipulate other people in the name of academic ideas. I personally dismay it from any angle that I can think about.
Well, we've been speaking with Ariel Rubinstein, who is professor of economics at Tel Aviv University and at New York University. Professor, such a pleasure speaking with you today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show is audience-supported media, and you can contribute any amount you want on Patreon, as little as $1 per month. Plus, you can get the daily bonus show, world famous at this point, and the daily commercial-free TV show by making those pledges at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. This is audience-supported media. We depend on the support of our viewers and listeners. Whether you listen to the podcast, watch on YouTube, or watch us on TV, or even listen on the radio, patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So you really have to see this. Donald Trump Jr. is so desperate for time on air, but also desperate for opportunities to talk about how his beloved father, the former president, is just so liked by everyone that he went on Sean Hannity's Fox News program last night, on which there were multiple segments about a group of people that came out in Florida with Trump flags to cheer Donald Trump on President's Day as Donald Trump drove, I guess, from golfing back to his resort or something like that. And this, as I was watching this, I actually almost felt slightly sorry for Don Jr., who, of course, is just so desperate to be liked by his dad, but so desperate to try to keep the party going, for lack of a better term. Check this out. First, you're going to see a clip here of Sean Hannity claiming that this group of it appears to be several hundred Trump supporters spontaneously appeared to cheer on Trump as he returned from golfing. Now, if you watch the video, you're going to notice people with gigantic flags, like 8-foot, 10-foot flags. These are not things you can say, oh, Trump's going to drive through. I'll just pop into 7-Eleven and get a 10-foot Don't Tread on Me or MAGA or MAGA or Trump flag. You have to plan for this stuff. The police cordons clearly were organized ahead of time. Anyway, nothing about it seems spontaneous. But here's Hannity saying, look at this spontaneous thing that just popped up.
This very day. Take a look right there. See that video? See what's on your screen? A few hours ago, spontaneously, thousands of people in Palm Beach lined up in support of the former president as his motorcade traveled through Florida. I have a question, Mitch McConnell, John Thune. How come you never had this kind of enthusiasm at any of your events? Take a look.
A defiant Sean Hannity there saying, hey, listen, a senator like John Thune, barely known to anybody, never had people with flags cheering them like a former president of the United States. What a kind of strange flex that is. But anyway, then that's not all, because in comes Don Jr. to talk about the, quote, totally organic parade of flag-bearing Trumpists that appeared. Take a look at this.
You're looking at Dad coming back from golf. Did you see thousands of people out of nowhere? Nobody organized it that I could see. No, certainly nobody associated with your father that I know of. Do you?
No, I mean, this is totally organic. And again, it just shows that the American people are with Donald Trump. Those millions of people. Sean, I saw it all day. I put up a separate video, even to the one that you posted earlier.
Now, it's actually really funny how Hannity hedges. Nobody organized thousands of people and a police presence. Well, no one associated with your father anyway. And I guess what Sean Hannity means is that Trump didn't organize it himself. OK, and Don Jr. really seems to be struggling with the math there. And you kept hearing this during the impeachment trial, actually, the disenfranchisement of 74 million people who voted for Trump. A few hundred or even 1,000 people getting out to support someone in a country of 330 million people, when Joe Biden got millions more votes than Donald Trump. What mathematical significance do a few hundred or even 1,000 people have? Now, on the facts, they're of course lying to you. There was nothing organic or spontaneous about this event. It was President's Day yesterday. People came from relatively far away for this. They drove with their flags. And people knew about the event starting at least a week before. It was being promoted. There was nothing coincidental about it. Here's one advertisement for the event from Right Side Broadcasting Network, starting to promote this well in advance. They even say, bring your flags. Those flags, you can't just stop in a 7-Eleven or a Walmart and get an 8-foot Trump flag. You've got to plan ahead. And what's more sad, I mean, listen, there's a lot of sad stuff going on here. One thing is, like, they always have to go further. They could just go with, there was great turnout on President's Day for Donald Trump. Okay, all right, well, a few hundred supporters came out. That's great. Why do you have to say it was spontaneous and it just popped up out of nowhere? Like, it's completely unbelievable. Obviously, it didn't pop out of nowhere. But maybe what's more sad is that Donald Trump Jr. is desperate, not just for relevance, but he's so desperate for Dad's approval. And that is, this is a cycle that repeats itself. We don't have to get all psychological, but Donald Trump was desperate for his dad's approval, and his dad treated him terribly. And that's where a lot of Trump's complex comes from. And it seems to be repeated exactly between Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. It's all sad, quite frankly, but it is what it is, as they say. And hopefully this will at some point kind of wind down. Hey, so listen, this is not the most important story, but we all need a little comedic relief every once in a while. And last night on Tucker Carlson's Fox News show, guest after guest lost their connection. And I don't know why, but I just found it hilarious. I think part of it is the look on Tucker Carlson's face every time his guests would lose connection. Now, I want to be really, really clear. Texas is having power outages right now. One of the guests who loses their internet connection is former Republican Governor Rick Perry, and Tucker Carlson mentions him being in Texas. Now, I don't know if the storms are actually the reason Rick Perry loses internet, and all of his guests, even the ones not in Texas, were losing connection. So it may have nothing to do, but we are not making light of what is happening in Texas right now, people without power. Okay, that's not what this is about. I think what's funny is Tucker doing his confused face every time it happens. So if you're only listening, that will be an element that you won't be able to observe unless you take a look at the video versions of this. But let's jump right into it. Here is former Texas governor, former Trump administration Secretary of Energy Rick Perry losing his connection. And Tucker tries to at least blame it on Rick's connection, although I doubt whether that's what's going on. Let's take a look.
So I love Texas.
don't want to attack Texas. On the other hand, the most basic responsibility of government, you'd think, is to keep the power on, especially when people need it to survive. They didn't. Why? I should say that Rick Perry is in Texas. It sounded like he was in space, but he's not. He's in Texas. He has no power. That's being run, I think, on a generator. He's proving the point that we're making. Governor, we're going to put you on hold for a second to see if we can get the power back on in your state.
Okay, so maybe it's the storms there, but then in comes Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican governor who was going on Tucker's show to brag about how they're just opening it wide open in Florida, regardless of the virus, and he loses his connection. Now, at this point, you can't blame the power outages in Texas for Ron DeSantis losing his connection, can you? Take a look.
Ever says that out loud. I mean, how could you ignore something that the data show? Oh, I'm afraid we've lost Governor DeSantis. Can you hear me, Governor?
I can't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I can hear the governor. He cannot hear me. I just want to say for the record that unlike as in Texas tonight, I think the power is still on in Florida. Fewer windmills in the state than there are in Texas. So that's the good news. But for some reason, the governor couldn't hear us. We'll be back in just a moment. A lot going on.
I was having a grand old time rewatching these this morning. It's also very poetic that a connection was lost because these are two people, Rick Perry and Ron DeSantis, who lost their connections with reality a long time ago. And I would actually argue that this was Ron DeSantis's best public statement ever, just losing his connection and being unable to say anything. He came off looking way better than he normally does when he's able to speak. And notice Tucker Carlson throwing in a dig at wind farms there, sort of laughing at windmills. And I think the idea there is that Tucker wants to frame anybody relying on wind farms can't possibly be keeping the power on compared to burning fossil fuels, which I guess is seen as manly and alpha among the American right. No opportunity to attack clean energy that Tucker Carlson won't avail himself of. And I mean, listen, being Texas, I'd almost expect Tucker to blame the power outages or the loss of connection on some migrant caravan approaching the border, which seems to be a catch-all anytime they need to blame anybody for anything, maybe even Antifa. But many tech problems happening on Tucker Carlson's program last night. I don't know why. I was laughing to myself this morning. Just really got a kick out of that one. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. We got a voicemail late last week about this new March 4th thing. There are QAnon people who I don't even know that I can say they believe it. They are saying, maybe they believe it. QAnon people are now saying that through some kind of bizarre technicality, Donald Trump is going to resume his presidency on March 4th. And I said, isn't this in some sense mental illness, delusional in a way? And a caller left me a voicemail saying it is, but there's also some of that on the left. Let's take a listen.
The latest March 4th QAnon thing, let's call it what it is. It's mental illness.
Okay.
But the Democrats are also guilty of having mental illness. They think this is the Wizard of Oz, where at some point the Republicans are going to discover that they had a brain the whole time. They had courage the whole time. They had conscience the whole time. They just didn't know it.
Right.
But it was there all along. Well, guess what, Alice? That's never going to happen because they don't have courage. They don't have conscience and they don't have a brain. And this March 4th babble is mental illness. And I would propose that to give it any media attention at all, even on, admittedly, an anti-QAnon YouTube progressive channel, still gives it a voice that it doesn't deserve.
All right, so there is a big admonishment there, but no, I think that what I completely agree with is, you know, throughout the Trump for decades, honestly, it happened during George W. Bush. It kept happening. But certainly during the Trump presidency, there would be the sense where, this is too much. Even the Trumpian lunatics aren't going to defend this. Clearly, Republican senators are now going to say this is too far. And of course, it never happened. And it is, in a sense, insanity to keep repeating the same expectation absent any evidence that should make us think this is too far. This is too low even for Republicans to think. No, it never is. It never is. And I do think that that's an important takeaway. And the caller is absolutely right. On the bonus show today, House impeachment managers are defending their decision not to call witnesses in the Trump impeachment trial after they voted to call witnesses. That's one story. Number two, Joe Biden is launching a review of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, and he is planning to close it before leaving office. We're still doing this. Yes, we're still talking about closing Gitmo. Maybe Joe Biden can get it done. And Parler is back again. It's like the website that just won't die. Parler is back again. We'll talk a little bit about the latest iteration and what impact it's having on the conservative dialogue, I guess we would call it. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get instant access by becoming a member at joinpakman.com. I'll see you then. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Unbiased News is a myth. Ground News is a news comparison platform that empowers you to see how the political biases of different sources are influencing the news you read. Download the Ground News app for free at davidpakman.com/ground.